So, this video, or series of videos maybe, we'll see, exists because I had to write a paper for the Game Design Academy I attend, and both I and the professors were very happy with the result. They pushed me not to let this project die in a drawer. Since nobody really wants to read 40 pages of a paper, I thought I'd turn it into a video to make it more accessible. English isn't my first language. I don't have the voice of a radio announcer, so this isn't my real voice. And trust me, it's better this way. I tried recording myself, but doing a decent job would have taken an amount of time I unfortunately don't have. Anyway, I hope whatever comes out of this turns out to be useful to someone. The guiding principle of this analysis is to study how designers manage the control available to the player, specifically, how it is continually granted and taken away, often by deliberately breaking well-established conventions, with a particular focus on the horror genre. In doing so, we will examine a range of titles, but we'll concentrate especially on a franchise that has made the illusion of control one of the pillars of its design, the 5 main entries of the Project Zero series, their respective remastered versions, and the remakes. This aspect will be analyzed by examining how it manifests across the game's narrative, visual presentation, and, above all, gameplay, where the boundary between deliberate design choice and genuine lack of care on the part of the designer becomes blurred, leaving doubt about what the real vision behind it actually was. In particular, we will study how the designer intervenes directly on controls and feedback, and where the fine line lies between a disruptive element and an intentional design choice. Finally, we will examine how remakes and remastered versions of older titles interpret this boundary and whether they successfully navigate it or fundamentally misread it. Why make a remake of an old video game? The reasons can be many, but they generally converge on 3 main motivations. A relatively secure financial return, thanks to an established audience's loyalty to the brand in question, the preservation of the game and its distribution on modern systems without the need for emulators, graphical improvements, and quality of life enhancements. The last motivation, in particular, is the subject of a heated debate that resurfaces every time yet another remake enters the market. Setting aside cases of outright betrayal of the source material, do all changes made in favor of improved playability actually make the gaming experience better? Often, such changes, if we refer to the most current theories of game design, represent objective improvements, especially when they involve the control system and feedback. Even more evident are the enhancements made to the visual presentation in the case of games that, even at the time of their original release, aspired to photorealism, or at least a certain degree of realism. The discussion around the visual aspect and gameplay is necessarily intertwined with technological progress and game design studies. Today, we have an enormous amount of reference material to draw upon, not just from video games themselves, but also from articles, essays, and scholarly treatises, not to mention dedicated academic programs. In the case of much older titles, however, the science of video games was still uncharted territory. This is precisely where a question naturally arises. If the developers of the past had had access to this pool of theoretical and technical knowledge, would the games they made look more like the originals or like today's remakes? To answer this question, we must remember that play is inherently about deliberately creating an inefficient system. Yet the tools used to play must be as efficient as possible in order to create what is known as meaningful play. So yes, it is possible that some developers, given the knowledge and capabilities described above, would paradoxically have made games that are more similar to the remakes of their own work, since anyone would want to exercise the fullest possible control over what they create. Even in games with emergent gameplay, that emergence must still occur within boundaries somehow anticipated by the designer. Otherwise, the game systems they have built risk breaking down entirely. However, there exists a genre in which the lack of control is a foundational element of what makes it unique. This characteristic permeates every aspect of the work, from the narrative to the visual presentation and the gameplay itself, in pursuit of a single effect: to instill fear and anxiety in the player. As will by now be clear, we are talking about horror games. Throughout our analysis, we will examine a range of titles, but our primary reference is the Project Zero series, also known as Zero in Japan and Fatal Frame in North America. From now on, we will refer to the series with the name Project Zero. Trust me, this time around, it's not just random numbers and letters at the end of the title of a Japanese game. You know which kind of titles I'm talking about. Anyway, the franchise comprises 5 main entries, 2 spin-offs, 2 remastered versions, and 2 remakes. Project Zero series is fairly conservative in its evolution, and the core elements of each individual game are essentially variations on a theme. These elements are primarily 3. 1. The narrative framework. The backstory of each entry begins with an ancient ritual that typically involves human sacrifice, intended to appease some form of spectral power that must not be unleashed into the world of the living. After centuries of tradition, something goes inevitably wrong, and, for various reasons, the ritual fails, causing a catastrophe within the community, entrusted with its performance and killing all its members, who end up trapped in a limbo between life and death in the form of ghosts. Many years later, set roughly in the present day, the game's protagonists become entangled in the community's history and must somehow lift the curse. 2. The setting references. All the stories in the Project Zero games are rooted in traditional Japanese folklore, particularly that relating to strange rituals and yurei, without drawing on any single specific tale but rather reworking its narrative tropes. 3. The gameplay. The concept behind the combat system is the ability to use a special camera, called the camera obscura, to exorcise ghosts by photographing them. The camera obscura's basic functions can be upgraded, and over the course of the adventure, the player can obtain new functions and special lenses to grant it additional powers. Now that we have an overview of the franchise's core elements, we will proceed to the heart of our analysis, starting from the narrative framework. Many video games place the player in front of narrative choices that will have a greater or lesser impact on the progression of the main quest or side quest. Typically, the player understands on their own when they are about to make such a choice. The most obvious example is multiple choice dialogue. In some cases, after making a narratively significant choice, the player is even given explicit feedback. The message, "This choice will have consequences," in the Life is Strange series has become iconic. In other cases, a slightly higher degree of attention is required from the player. It is possible that, when facing a fork in the level design, a secondary character, or the playable character themselves in the case of a monologue, mentions that taking one path over another will have consequences on the unfolding of events. If the player has not paid attention to the hint provided, they may make an uninformed decision and simply follow their instinct, or worse, chance. And an uninformed decision is essentially no decision at all. In yet other cases, When the player is about to take a path that will lead to an important narrative outcome, the game warns them with an on-screen message or another form of feedback. An example is provided by Project 02. If the protagonist Mio attempts to leave the village of Minakami, an on-screen message asks the player whether they are sure they want to leave, abandoning their sister Mayu to her fate. If the player confirms, they will be led to the so-called bad ending. The game is not explicitly telling us we are heading towards an alternative ending, but it is nonetheless alerting us to the narrative significance of our choice. These initial examples primarily concern narratives in which the player is given a high degree of control over their ability to influence the unfolding of events, thanks to the many feedback cues provided. But what happens when the designer decides to reduce or entirely remove such feedback, diminishing the player's sense of control? One example in this respect is found in the so-called Souls games, all the games developed by From Software that trace their lineage to Demon's Souls. In these games, quests often progress by completing a series of operations, such as speaking to NPCs in a specific order, finding objects, defeating particular enemies, and so on, according to an extremely obscure logical scheme. In the best cases, this means that the most attentive players who have dug deeply into interpreting the game's context are rewarded with the completion of a quest. However, it sometimes happens that even the most hardcore players complain about the absence of logical steps in quest progression, which frequently leads to failure without any real understanding of why. This persistent sense of uncertainty that takes hold of the player due to the lack of clear, immediately recognizable feedback can be considered a flaw in certain video games. However, given the context in which the various Souls games are set, this characteristic, or absence, actually takes on a precise meaning. The game worlds in these titles are always dark and extremely hostile, and the player must constantly feel alienated and confronted with tasks far beyond the means at their disposal. The absence of feedback, normally considered a flaw, is therefore intentional on the part of the designer and contextualized in relation to the other components of the game. Still, this does not prevent the player's frustration at mysteriously failing a quest, making it a bold but risky, if not problematic, design choice. Even more interesting is the case of Silent Hill 2 and its remake. Here, the conditions required to unlock one of the multiple endings available to the player are not tied to specific dialogue choices or precise in-game actions, but rather to an entire behavioral code embedded within the game's mechanics. For example, some conditions require maintaining the protagonist's health above a certain threshold, or spending time with an NPC in a room without being able to interact with them in any meaningful way, or not killing too many enemies, and so on. It is a very interesting system, but it has one significant flaw. The player is never told that the game tracks a system of behavior rather than choices. Choice is a narrative element that, in the vast majority of cases, is self-evident and is by now a codified design pattern in the gaming culture of the average player. Everyone knows that if a game presents two or more choices, there will probably be specific consequences for each. We use probably because not all choices need necessarily have a tangible outcome, but that is a separate discussion. Conversely, it is by no means automatic for the player to believe that their playstyle is shaping the narrative. Even in role-playing games, different builds, which concretely affect gameplay, correspond to playstyles rather than ethical stances. A stealth build will probably lead to fewer enemy kills than an aggressive one, but choosing one over the other is, almost always, a matter of preference. Returning to Silent Hill 2 by providing no feedback whatsoever, the designer forces the player to make uninformed choices that, as noted above, are not real choices. The player's lack of control over the consequences of their decisions, which they do not even know they have made, since those consequences are governed by a behavioral code whose existence is never disclosed, is indeed motivated by the game's context. The protagonist finds himself alone in an extremely alien, hostile world governed by its own logic. But in this case, it strips too much from the gaming experience and ends up working against the designer. If showing the player an explicit warning about these internal rules of conduct before the adventure begins would have been an inelegant solution, it might have been possible to include a side quest, as in the Souls games, or at least a narrative arc in which the consequences were immediately recognizable as directly resulting from the player's behavior. In that case, it would not even be necessary to specify which particular behaviors played a key role in determining the outcome. It would suffice to make the player understand that their playstyle carries narrative weight, keeping them in a constant state of uncertainty, while still providing a hint about a design pillar too important, especially in a game where narrative is arguably its greatest strength, to go uncommunicated. Furthermore, given that the number of enemies killed influences the ending, providing the player with dedicated stealth mechanics for hiding and avoiding enemies would have served as a useful, albeit extremely subtle, clue, rather than being entirely absent from the game. The point is that while it wasn't necessary for the game to explain the consequences of the player's behavior, it would have been beneficial for the gaming experience if the game had at least warned the player that consequences existed without specifying what they were. It is worth briefly examining the choice of adversaries the player must face throughout the adventure, as their characterization depends not only on the context in which they appear, but also on the feelings they are intended to evoke in the player. To explore this aspect, it is particularly illuminating to refer to an interview with one of Project Zero's creators, Keisuke Kikuchi, in which he explains how the team arrived at the game's concept. The initial intention was to create a competitor to the survival horror titles most popular at the time, namely Silent Hill and Resident Evil. To avoid simply producing a clone, a completely different type of enemy was needed compared to those the player faces in those franchises. The enemies in Resident Evil and Silent Hill are tangible and organic. They physically attack the player, and the consequence of their attacks is the player's death, accompanied by gore and flowing blood. Even though in Silent Hill, especially in the already mentioned second entry, these enemies are actually personifications of the protagonist's obsessions and phobias, as opposed to the zombies and other creatures that populate Resident Evil's environments independently of the playable character's psyche. They are still tangible threats whose attacks cause physical damage. By contrast, the enemies in Project Zero are ghosts. They were once human, but are no longer. They are now something else entirely, indefinite, forever suspended between life and death. When they attack the player, the encounters are not violent in the way described above. Blood is kept to a minimum. It is precisely the uncertainty about what kind of suffering their attacks are causing that creates that creeping sense of constant unease. When a zombie or monster kills the player immediately understands that their character has simply died. When a ghost kills them, it is not entirely clear what their fate is. They might vanish from the world forever, remain trapped in a limbo between life and death, or, worse, join the ranks of the spirits that have drained their life force. This very concept gave rise to the Japanese name of the series Zero, which refers to the ghosts, as their characterization nullifies any assumption or certainty the player might hold regarding them. The enemy itself, through its ineffability, embodies the player's lack of control over what happens in the game. Show, don't tell is one of the fundamental principles of good storytelling. It applies primarily to cinema, but is also an excellent device in written literature, particularly in horror. In the latter case, since writing without a visual medium necessarily requires telling, the trick lies in providing as few details as possible, allowing the reader's imagination to take over, sometimes amplifying the true extent of things by integrating aspects of their own experience that may be entirely foreign to the original concept. This technique is one of the foundational principles of H.P. Lovecraft's style, which suggests the threat without ever truly describing it, which is why his works are notoriously difficult to adapt for media based on sight. This is because while cinema relies on showing too much often proves counterproductive for building tension. It is more effective to hold back the moment of revelation as an ace up one's sleeve for the climax, or even to deny it entirely. Films that employ this technique play on negative spaces, silences, and the anticipation of something looming that may or may not come to pass. As these examples suggest, the faithful reproduction of reality generally gives the viewer greater control and, consequently, possibly less engagement. If everything is explicit, the imaginative effort is reduced. In this regard, it is natural to think of how the advent of photography, which reproduced reality objectively, completely overturned the canons of painting and sculpture, which until that point had focused on realism. We are talking about the original concept of photography, not artistic photography, which is in fact highly subjective. The technical medium itself was born as an attempt to faithfully reproduce reality. It is no coincidence that after the advent of photography, the other visual arts increasingly favored the centrality of the artist's personal vision, leading to Impressionism and, later, various forms of abstraction. Essentially, knowing too much leaves little room for the imagination, to such an extent that one of the other consequences of the widespread adoption of photography was a dramatic decline in reports of religious miracles, as it became natural to believe only what could be seen with one's own eyes, rather than relying on accounts. All of these principles can be applied to video games as well, but must be analyzed bearing in mind that this is a medium deeply dependent on technological means. One of the primary goals of a horror game is not only to instill fear, but to ensure that the feeling of anxiety and unease lingers in the player, even after they have put down the game and returned to the real world. One might naturally assume that achieving this effect requires a realistic visual style, so as to create a parallel between the game world and the real world. This is the principle by which a rule is established only to be broken at the right moment, a technique that will serve as a true leitmotif throughout our analysis, as it can be applied in multiple ways. In this specific case, the rule, the implicit pact between player and game, is that while playing, the player is in a danger zone where the risks they face feel real thanks to the suspension of disbelief, and the feelings of terror and fear are genuinely experienced on a personal level. The moment the player puts down the controller, they return to the real world, which is a safe zone where they know nothing can harm them. And yet, if the play session was particularly frightening, those same feelings persist in the safe zone, even though the player is fully aware there is no reason to feel them. This can happen precisely because the game's visual style was so realistic that in the player's mind, the two realities, that of the game and that of the real world, overlap, which is indeed the main reason behind the pursuit of photorealism typical of AAA video games. However, this principle can also be applied in reverse. If the game's visual style does not aim for realism, but rather for abstraction, the player fills in the missing visual information with their own imagination. But this also occurs in everyday reality when something familiar loses its recognizable features. For example, in the dark, the fear of the dark is not a fear of darkness itself, but is in fact a consequence of the atavistic fear of the unknown and of what might be lurking in the shadows. It is a fear of uncontrolled potential fueled by one's own imagination. In a game, if the lighting system is outdated or primitive, the perception of space will be unclear. Similarly, if enemies are rendered with a low polygon count and low resolution textures, the player's perception of their features will be filled in by their own imagination. This is because from the dawn of time, humans have always felt the need to explain every event and to dispel every mystery. However, if a reality is completely unfathomable or excessively cryptic, humans often give up entirely on exploring it or on forming any opinion about it. If, on the other hand, that reality sits on the fine line between the familiar and the alien, the effect is to stimulate the desire to probe it. In the case of enemies in a game, the inability to form a clear mental image of what the player is seeing, despite being confronted with something whose features may seem familiar, produces the short circuit at the root of fear. I see a being that reminds me of something I already know, and yet I cannot be entirely certain of what it is. This very idea underpins the design of the ghosts in the Fatal Frame games, or at least in the older entries of the franchise. Let us recall the idea behind the name Project Zero discussed in the previous chapter. I recognize the enemy as the ghost of a human being, but its form is evanescent and unclear. In this case, the very limitations of the rendering techniques of the era contribute to feeding this feeling. If we instead examine the enemy models in the more recent entries of the series, we notice how technological advancement has brought greater realism at the cost of a reduced sense of estrangement. Comparing the design of the ghost models in the 5th chapter with those of the 1st makes it clear what has been gained and what has been lost along the way. The same can be said for the defeat animations of the enemies, which flood the screen with sometimes excessive amounts of particle effects, as if the victory needed a visual confirmation. That said, it is likely that had the developers of the time had access to the same tools available today, the enemies of the original Project Zero would have looked very much like those in the 5th entry. In that regard, the remake for the 2nd chapter reaches, to a certain degree, a good balance between realism and suggestion. Nevertheless, some modern games, particularly in the contemporary indie landscape, deliberately choose to adopt a visual style harking back to games from the late 1990s and early 2000s, so much so that one might already speak of a fully fledged retro aesthetic trend. Two of the most notable examples are Mouthwashing, which exploits its aesthetic to heighten the sense of the uncanny, and Signalis, which focuses more on the uncertainty of forms to instill fear and which references, both in its gameplay and its visual style, the early Resident Evil games. The ever-growing number of games that draw on a retro aesthetic demonstrates that both approaches, exploiting extreme realism or moving in completely the opposite direction, are equally valid. Project Zero 4 was originally released as a Nintendo Wii exclusive in 2008, but received a port to PC and modern consoles in 2023. Comparing the two versions, the shift in approach to visual presentation is immediately apparent. The remastering work involved primarily the models of the protagonists and of the ghosts, but above all, it is the lighting and visual effects that differ most dramatically. This is not merely a color palette that shifts towards cooler, bluer tones. The image generally features much higher contrast values, and the key elements of the scene, the playable character, enemies, and pathways, are more brightly lit. this is certainly a credit to a more advanced lighting system capable of managing a greater number of light sources than was previously possible. However, having access to more light sources does not necessarily mean they all need to be used. A deliberate choice was made. In the remastered version, light defines forms far more clearly than in the original. In this context, clarity is indeed the key word, and the most immediately visible result is a better reading of the scene, which in turn grants the player greater awareness when making decisions that may affect numerous aspects of gameplay. This awareness makes it easier for the player to locate collectible items, to find the right path sooner, or, perhaps most importantly, in a game where environments are generally characterized by cramped spaces offering little room for maneuver, to position themselves more effectively relative to enemies, since these are more clearly visible. In essence, the player's comfort level is higher than in the original, and their sense of control over the gameplay situation is greater. And yet, while this choice improves playability, it diminishes the sense of uncertainty and helplessness in a setting that should feel as hostile and alien as possible, something that should be one of the primary objectives of a game of this kind. In this case, too, there is no right or wrong choice. It is simply a matter of two different approaches, one favoring comfort, the other immersion. A distinctive visual technique used in every entry of this series, according to a fairly original principle, is the alternation between color and black and white. Normally, the use of black and white is a practice that, through cultural codification, connotes a narrative flashback. The player automatically associates the absence of color with early photographs and early films, which were indeed black and white. As a result, a cutscene or a gameplay section devoid of color is perceived as belonging to a time prior to that in which the game's story takes place. In this respect, the Project Zero games also make use of this relatively simple device to narrate flashbacks without explicitly labeling them as such. However, there are numerous gameplay sections presented in black and white, sometimes with an almost monochromatic appearance, filtered through heavy distortions that significantly obscure the image. This occurs when the player is dealing with particularly powerful ghosts or finds themselves exploring areas permeated by an unusually intense spectral energy. One of the most famous instances of this filter is the section in Project Zero 2 in which the player is chased for the first time by the main antagonist Sei, whose spirit is corrupted by that of the Kusabi, who, as they will discover to their cost, is invincible until the final confrontation. Another example occurs in one of the final chapters of Project Zero 3, where the miasma mechanic is introduced. The player has access to a candle that burns down over time and can be replenished with collectible items, and which protects them from a kind of spectral miasma. Once it goes out, the probability of the main antagonist Reika, who is invincible until the final battle, appearing without warning and pursuing the player increases dramatically. In both cases, the filter is applied as soon as the candle goes out and is lifted when it is relit. Fighting and navigating when the image is so heavily distorted is extremely difficult, and the player's sense of control over what is happening drops dramatically, creating gameplay situations that are at times frustrating, but perfectly in keeping with the designer's intended message. What is the reasoning behind this choice? The answer lies in how the world of the living is conceived in relation to that of the dead. Human vision is in color. To be suddenly deprived of it is as if the reality around us changed and we were catapulted into another world. In the case of Fatal Frame, the world of the dead. Black and white, therefore, evokes not only the concept of the past, which is intrinsically linked to the idea of a ghost, but also the concept of the alien. I see the world in color while exploring or fighting ghosts. I am still in my own world, which follows rules I have come to know. I see the world in black and white. The rules I have applied until now no longer hold, and anything is possible. Because I am no longer in my world, but in that of the dead. The only thing I can do is flee until I return to my colorful reality. One of the riskiest ways in which horror games break the conventions of good game design is by directly intervening on the element of reactivity and fluidity. That is, the precision with which our avatar follows the commands we input via the controller. In essence, it involves deliberately reducing the player's comfort level with the pad in hand, an operation carried out primarily by working on control responsiveness and camera management. The rationale for such a drastic and almost metagaming choice, since it does not affect the game world itself but directly the way in which the player communicates with it, consists mainly in heightening the sense of panic during a confrontation, or in making the player feel lost within an alien environment. However, the thin line between an element that reinforces the game's mood and a genuine disruptive element is extremely fine. Project 0, 1, 2, and 3 opted for a fixed camera during exploratory gameplay sections, while the 4th and 5th entries, as well the remake of the 2nd chapter, switched to a third-person camera. In every entry, however, the camera shifts to a first-person perspective when the camera obscura is in use, as if the player were operating a real camera. The fixed camera was very much in vogue among horror games at the time of Project 0, 1, and 2. However, by the time the 3rd entry was released in July 2005, it was already considered an outdated choice, in part due to the success of Resident Evil 4, released in January of the same year. The reasons for the camera transitions that more recent entries of established franchises underwent at the time were mainly three. 1. Easier directional changes. With every camera switch during the exploration of an environment, the player had to recalibrate the direction of their avatar. Sometimes this involved minor adjustments, but in cases of a reverse angle cut, the player had to quickly move in the opposite direction to the one they had just been heading. This could prove frustrating during a chase sequence or a gameplay section with some form of timer. 2. Clear exploration. Some fixed camera placements clearly framed certain areas of the map, but blocked the view of others, allowing the player to look around a full 360 degrees, improved orientation. 3. Spatial awareness. During combat, the very lack of a clear sightline to all traversable paths available to the player at their current position created a significant handicap stemming entirely from an unjustified information asymmetry between the player and their avatar. If the player can move the avatar through 360 degrees, the avatar knows whether a path is accessible or not, but the player often does not because of the camera, and ends up in a dead end, or accidentally facing the very enemy they were fleeing, something the in-game character would never voluntarily do. A kind of desynchronization between player and avatar thus arose, which almost never found any concrete justification within the game's world. In essence, the rationale behind the transition from a fixed to a third-person camera reflects the designer's desire to give the player greater control. However, while this reasoning makes almost universal sense for games that are more action-oriented and focused on combat, one of the most anxiety-inducing factors in horror games is precisely the disparity between the player and the threats they must face. That is, their lack of control over the situation they find themselves in. For this very reason, the fixed camera also offers advantages over the third-person perspective, And the most paradoxical fact is that these advantages are literally the inverse of the features listed above. More cumbersome directional changes, awkward exploration to heighten the sense of disorientation, and limited spatial awareness to create an additional handicap in combat. There is no right choice, even though directly compromising playability is considered almost a taboo. What matters is what the designer prioritizes, the player's comfort or their disorientation. The trick lies in producing tension in the player without crossing the line into pure disruption. Furthermore, the fixed camera offers specific narrative possibilities that the third-person camera does not, because it works through framing. It takes no great theoretical knowledge to make clear how much information the choice of framing can communicate to the player. The shot composition, especially in a horror game, is often carefully designed to instill anxiety and fear in the player, playing with angle and composition, negative spaces, light and shadow, and a range of other factors that are reduced or entirely absent in the third-person camera, because control over it is handed from the designer to the player. Through carefully crafted level design, it is possible to construct a kind of framing even in games where the camera is not fixed. But in that case, the designer relies on the assumption that the player is pointing the camera in the direction they are walking, which is extremely likely, but never guaranteed, even when the camera is not directly controllable by the player. Indeed, despite the fact that in the most recent chapters, like Project 04, the camera always faces in the direction the player is heading and cannot therefore be controlled by them. There are moments where the audio component, through the score and ambient sounds, and visual component, through the HUD and image filters, suggests the presence of a ghost that the player cannot locate before it disappears, leaving the player simply confused by a frightening event that occurred nearby, but which they did not witness. This also depends on the level design, but in the first 3 entries, such situations are extremely rare. It is also worth noting that the third-person camera in Project 04 is positioned to one side of the avatar, as in many similar titles, but the offset is so minimal that the playable character is almost centered in the frame, and in some areas, fully centered. This choice is likely a compromise between the new camera type and a level design similar to that of the earlier entries, based on corridors and predominantly cramped spaces that would have made it difficult to position the camera too far to the side. It is, however, a solution that often proves partially counterproductive for the exploration mechanics, which rely on using the torch, controlled by the Wiimote, to reveal the presence of collectible objects that are invisible to the player, but whose approximate location is indicated by a radar. The avatar frequently obstructs the view of an object highlighted by the torch. The player hears the audio cue for finding an item but cannot see where it is because, paradoxically, it is directly in front of the avatar, who is perfectly aware of the object's position. In this case, it constitutes a genuine disruptive element, rather than a choice designed to increase anxiety, for a series of reasons that will be examined in the section dedicated to interactions. Before discussing how controls are handled in the Project Zero games, it is worth emphasizing how an apparently purely technical factor, feedback, is in fact an extremely significant communicative medium for conveying a game's context. Highly responsive, fast, and light controls are associated with games that have a fast pace and a stronger action orientation, often exaggerated and deliberately unrealistic. Animations are calibrated in the same spirit, skipping or accelerating animation transitions and their windups. Conversely, designers sometimes deliberately introduce a slight delay in controls and soften transitions between animations to promote greater realism, particularly in slower-paced games that are less focused on combat than on exploration. What we have just described is not a rule to be followed rigidly according to the game genre, and indeed, the very concept of genre is increasingly outdated in this context. Consider, for example, a random entry from the Devil May Cry series compared to The Witcher 3. It is true that the latter is certainly more exploration-oriented and has a more measured pace than the frenetic action of Devil May Cry, but both games place a strong emphasis on combat and action, and yet the feedback provided to the player through the controls could not be more different. Devil May Cry focuses on speed and responsiveness, disregarding realism. The Witcher does the exact opposite. These titles are simply examples of two different schools of thought suited to two different types of action that, in some games, can even overlap in certain aspects with particularly effective results. In essence, the game feel contributes enormously to defining the pace of a game and communicating its context and mood to the player. What is the approach taken in Project Zero? In the first 3 entries, the controls, as in many horror games, always carry a slight delay, and the avatar's animations are extremely sluggish, partly, in all likelihood, by design, and partly also due to technical limitations. The chosen approach was one of low control responsiveness to convey a sense of slowness and inevitability, sensations that are indeed well suited to the game's context, given that the Project Zero stories are rooted in Japanese folklore and the settings are almost always based on traditional architecture, characterized by straight lines and a rigorous handling of space. The fixedness of the architecture, in turn, reiterates the concept underlying the enemies, that of being ghosts trapped in a limbo between past and present. However, this does not translate into genuine realism in movement. The characters are stiff, their walk is slow and uncertain, almost as if in slow motion at times, and running consists merely in adopting a slightly brisker pace. While a reduced walking speed is certainly an appropriate choice given that the playable character is exploring a house haunted by ghosts, the limited running speed may appear anachronistic, particularly during a chase. In fact, far from favoring realism, any person would run at full speed from a ghost, this is actually a deliberate choice. The designer has intervened at the level of the communication channel between player and avatar, that is, the controls, to heighten the sense of panic during particularly intense gameplay sections. In essence, the designer has opted for a solution that follows the same design philosophy as the fixed camera over the third-person camera, stripping control from the player by intervening directly on the interface itself, rather than on the rules of the game world. Bold choices of this kind also reinforce one of the foundational design principles of the horror mechanism we have already discussed, that of violating the safe zone, where, in this case, the safe zone is the controls themselves, which ideally should interpose as few filters as possible between the player's intention and the avatar's action. These interventions on the controls risk, however, becoming genuine disruptive elements capable of provoking frustration in the player rather than fostering immersion. The first 3 entries of Project Zero chose to take this risk by opting for a fixed camera, which, as discussed, by blocking the view of certain parts of the map, can itself be considered a disruptive element, arising from an unjustified desynchronization between the avatar's knowledge and the player's. It should be noted, however, that the player can at any time equip the camera obscura, effectively switching to a first-person perspective that allows them to look around a full 360 degrees. The handling of movement also underwent a small but significant improvement in favor of better playability compared to competitors. If the player presses the button assigned to running, the avatar will begin to run in the direction they are already facing, without necessarily having to move the analog stick, which determines direction, and, if moved without pressing the run button, activates walking. This means that during a run, if a camera transition occurs, particularly in the case of a reverse angle cut, it is easier for the player to keep the avatar moving in the desired direction without risking a sudden reversal towards the point of origin, precisely because the avatar moves regardless of analog stick input, the stick being used only to change direction, not to move. Moving from the third to the fourth and fifth entries, the running mechanic remains unchanged. However, with the shift from a fixed camera to a third-person camera, the control scheme adopts a somewhat unusual combination of controls. The camera can be controlled using the right analog stick, which also determines the player's facing direction. With the left analog stick, the player can move in any direction, including toward the camera. However, while running, the horizontal axis of the right analog stick is disabled, leaving the player able to control only the vertical axis. Needless to say, the designer's approach to this control scheme is, to say the least, inconsistent. This frequently causes the avatar to get caught in the environment, and the player must make micro adjustments to position, even to perform basic actions such as picking up items. During combat, movement management becomes even more problematic. However, the player can rapidly rotate the avatar 180 degrees by shaking the Wiimote in the fourth entry and pressing a button in the fifth, allowing for easier repositioning relative to enemies. Some choices in the more recent entries seem to contribute to improved comfort for the player, while others appear to move in a completely opposite direction. In general, however, the speed at which the avatar performs each of these actions, from movement to running to looking around while using the camera obscura, has increased considerably compared to the older entries. All of this remains in line with the modernization approach we have already observed when discussing the visual presentation of the fifth entry and the remaster of the fourth. The result is that the player generally has more control over their avatar, for better and for worse. Once the rules governing the controls have been established, it is necessary to analyze how the player communicates with and interacts with the game world. As we will see, the logic behind the choices in this area is based on establishing rules that the player comes to rely on, only to subvert them entirely. The environments in Project Zero are mostly composed of closed, cramped spaces, often separated by doors. These doors, particularly in the older entries, frequently blend into the very walls to which they are hinged due to the low resolution of the textures, a result of the graphical engine's limitations at the time. There are no diegetic indications of their presence. The era of yellow stripes guiding the most inattentive players was still a long way off. The only tools available to the player are their own eyes, bearing in mind that the most common resolution on PlayStation 2 was 480p, and their intuition, derived from observing the architecture and level design. The alternative is to open the in-game map from the menu, which provides a floor plan of the game world, but only shows areas that have already been explored. Furthermore, once a door has been found, no on-screen prompt indicates which button to press to interact with it, so the player must deduce on their own whether the low-resolution texture in front of their avatar is a door or not by pressing the interaction button. The low visibility of doors during a combat or chase sequence is technically a disruptive element, but whether by design intent or purely technical limitation, ultimately contributes to the player's panic as they frantically search for the exit from a room haunted by a particularly powerful ghost, once again, thanks to a reduction in the player's available control. There are also features more closely tied to the narrative that serve to heighten the sense of unpredictability and disorientation. Some doors, upon first interaction, turn out to be locked. Often, after this interaction, a kind of visual artifact will appear on the door. This spectral trace can be photographed with the camera obscura, revealing an image of another location where a cursed object or spirit must be photographed to unlock the door. However, some doors instead remain mysteriously locked even though the player may have previously opened them, and no visual artifact appears to photograph. A new interaction is required, sometimes logically disconnected, such as simply exploring the room in search of a new clue, or waiting for a ghost apparition, or reaching the other side of the door via an alternative route. In other cases, a locked door unlocks after a ghost walks through it during a scripted appearance, as if suggesting to the player to follow it. But even then, it is never a guarantee, and other conditions may exist. In essence, the player receives clues about how doors function, and precisely when they think they have grasped the rules, they encounter an exception. While some players might feel frustrated and accuse the designer of cheating at their own game by violating the rules they have imposed, the intended effect is to keep the player constantly on edge, preventing them from taking for granted that any plan they devise will reliably succeed. Every time the player interacts with a door, they must be prepared for a surprise, and even the opening animations underscore this intent. The characters take an exaggeratedly long time to open doors. In some cases, the animation even pauses for a fraction of a second. In part, the slowness of the gesture recalls the door opening animations in early Resident Evil games, which served to buy time while a new area loaded. Indeed, the question remains whether it is a deliberate choice or whether the game is performing some kind of loading, but the result is clear. Suspense increases, especially since the more informed player knows that if the game is loading something, that something could be a hostile ghost lying in wait on the other side, ready to attack. Once again, the fear of what might happen is often more powerful than the realization of that potential. Some collectible objects in the first 3 Project Zero entries are immediately visible to the player and highlighted by a pale blue particle effect. However, other objects can be found inside wardrobes, chests of drawers, and similar pieces of furniture, with no on-screen indication alerting the player to the possibility of interaction when their avatar is near an explorable element. A similar approach also applies to objects that are essential for progression, which, despite not being hidden inside furniture and being in plain sight, may not appear interactable to the player due to the outdated polygonal modeling, low-resolution textures, and, above all, the absence of any on-screen indication. This has both a positive and a negative consequence. On one hand, it encourages the player to carefully observe their surroundings and explore them thoroughly. On the other, it leads to the player repeatedly pressing the interaction button near furniture items in the hope that they might be interactable. The more attentive player, however, soon learns to recognize which pieces of furniture are truly interactable and which are not, without having to obsessively press the interaction button. In the 4th entry, objects are not immediately visible, but their proximity is signaled by a kind of radar. Once close enough, the player must illuminate with the torch, controlled via the Wiimote, the spot where they believe the object to be. Only then is it revealed. This is an anachronistic choice, as it does not contribute to the player's anxiety, but only to their frustration, for 2 reasons. First, it is the not knowing whether an object is present or not that keeps the player on edge. Once its presence is revealed, making it difficult to collect only produces frustration. In some cases, maybe due to imprecise colliders or bugs, objects from the adjacent room are mistakenly revealed. and the revelation of the object is always accompanied by a corresponding sound, leaving the player confused as to its actual location. Second, if we were to follow the design philosophy that it is legitimate to intervene on controls to reduce the player's control, this mechanic could heighten panic when the player tries to collect a healing item during a fight. But during combat, the ability to collect items is deactivated, something that does not occur in the first 3 entries. So there is no reason to artificially increase the difficulty of collection. In the 4th, 5th, and remastered version of the second entry, as well as its remake, it is still possible to find objects inside furniture elements, but when one of these is interactable, which does not always result in finding an object but may simply prompt a description, the image of the interaction button appears on screen, bypassing the player's process of environmental interpretation at a point when, thanks to greater graphical fidelity, it might not even be necessary. Furthermore, in these 3 entries, a particularly interesting mechanic is introduced, one that clearly aims to make item collection more anxiety-inducing without intervening on the controls, but rather on the way the avatar interacts with the game world, yet ultimately causes only repetitiveness and irritation. When the player stands in front of an interactable object, they must hold down the interaction button to extend the avatar's hand until it touches the object. Releasing the button causes the hand to gradually withdraw. The rationale behind this choice is similar to that underlying the door animations, to build suspense through a slow gesture. Moreover, just as the avatar's hand is about to reach the object, spectral hands may appear and attempt to grab it. The player can evade the attack by shaking the Wiimote in the 4th entry and the Wii remake of the 2nd, or by withdrawing their hand in the 5th. All of this presents numerous problems. First, some objects do not require this mini-game, while others do, with no clear logic behind the distinction. This leads to the player becoming confused and pressing the interaction button without holding it, only to discover they needed to hold it, or vice versa. Every time this mini-game begins, a camera switch occurs, meaning a simple button press causes a rapid and extremely jarring transition from the standard camera to the minigame camera and then back again. In the 4th entry, once the minigame has started, it is possible to exploit the mechanic of extending the arm by pressing the interaction button rapidly and repeatedly rather than holding it, thereby more effectively avoiding the spectral hands, but causing the avatar's arm to jerk back and forth, resulting in an almost comical effect. Finally, while the design philosophy behind the minigame is the same as for the doors, in the case of the latter it works, because the number of times the player opens a door is generally lower than the number of times they collect an object, and also because the outcome of opening a door is not a simple spectral hand that grabs the player, but a real combat encounter or a scripted event. The surprise is effective precisely because it is rare and meaningful. When it happens constantly and its outcome isn't particularly interesting, it ceases to be a surprise and becomes merely an annoyance and a distraction. A device found in many games, not only horror, to raise the tension level, is to deprive the player of the tools they are accustomed to for a section of the game. When this occurs in a game where the basic controls are deliberately cumbersome, and we're even operating the sole piece of equipment available, which is also the only means of defense against enemies, is already difficult to begin with, anxiety increases exponentially. In the 2nd chapter of Project Zero, the protagonist, Mio, unintentionally drops the camera obscura while being chased by the antagonist, Sei. Before she can retrieve it, the player must navigate an entire section in which they can only hide and flee from hostile ghosts, with no ability to confront them. It must be acknowledged that the game mechanics, lacking genuine stealth components, show their weaknesses more than once in this specific scenario, at times making the gameplay feel like trial and error. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that the tension rises enormously precisely because the player must rely on mechanics grounded in controls that, by their very nature, are unresponsive and dramatically increase the disadvantage relative to the enemies. A similar section exists in Project Zero 3, with the addition of a stealth mechanic consisting simply of the ability to crouch, a mechanic so rudimentary that the player uses it only very sporadically. So far, we have discussed how the designer can physically deprive the player of their means of defense. However, there exists an even more insidious method. Rather than letting the player know they have lost their weapon, thus triggering initial panic, followed by the adoption of logical strategies to work around the problem, the designer allows the player to use their equipment while simultaneously rendering it completely ineffective against a specific enemy without offering any explanation. In the Project Zero games, the arrival of these invincible enemies is foreshadowed by the shift to the black and white or monochromatic filter, a convention the player learns to decipher only after experiencing it firsthand on multiple occasions and connecting the drastic chromatic palette change to the presence of certain enemies. These are typically the same final bosses who can only be defeated at the end of the game, after adequate narrative build-up. On their first appearances, however, the player falls into a panic while photographing them with the camera obscura, to no effect whatsoever. We have already discussed how the word zero in the name Project Zero hints at the inscrutable nature of the enemies the player will face in the games of this franchise, as they follow the logic of a world that is the opposite of the living. Breaking conventions is an innate trait of ghosts. Among all the abilities a ghost possesses, there is one in particular that would, on paper, shatter an equilibrium that has existed since the earliest video games. In level design, physical boundaries are established that cannot be crossed by the player or NPCs without a valid justification, be they walls, entire buildings, and so on. What happens when enemies can not only appear and disappear at will, but even pass through walls? Other than certain scripted encounters, discussions about the mechanics governing the logic behind enemy spawn patterns in the Project Zero series, which vary from entry to entry, continue to this day on Reddit and various forums. In the first 3 entries and in the 5th, for example, there's always a random chance that a ghost will spawn at any moment and in any location on the map. In the 4th, random spawns exist, but are tied to specific areas and certain points in the story. Some players even speculate that in the 3rd entry, keeping the camera obscura equipped, thereby remaining in first-person view, increases the probability of a random encounter. Others claim that pointing the camera obscura at certain objects or specific points on the game map, even without taking a photo, can trigger the appearance of an enemy. To illustrate how the mystery surrounding enemy spawn rules contributes to the anxiety factor, it may be useful to recount a personal anecdote I witnessed myself. While watching a friend play Project Zero 3 to study their behavior in-game and their reactions to events, they had stopped in front of a wall with an unusual texture that stood out from the rest of the corridor's standard repeating surfaces, as if a human silhouette could be faintly made out on it. While examining it through the camera obscura for a closer look, an enemy suddenly appeared before us and promptly attacked, causing, predictably, a moment of uncontrolled panic. After winning the encounter, many questions lingered. Did we trigger the spawn by aiming at that unusual wall? Or was it simply a coincidence? Even by reloading the previous save and repeating the same action, the questions would have remained unanswered. Since spawns are governed by probabilities rather than guarantees, perhaps pointing the camera obscura at that particular spot does carry some probability of triggering the enemy we faced, but it is not certain. Precisely this inability to reach a definitive conclusion and the resulting state of total uncertainty is a powerful source of anxiety. A similar point applies to the radar available to the player for detecting enemy locations. It sometimes happens that the radar lights up briefly before going dark again, with no ghost visible in the vicinity. Normally, when a ghost appears, there are audio and visual feedback cues, image filters change, sounds play, music shifts, but in this case, none of this occurs. Did a ghost actually appear briefly, or was it simply a bug? The player is left without an answer, and it is precisely this not knowing that generates anxiety. The design philosophy behind the spawn behavior favors unpredictability, which is amplified even further by an additional factor. Ghosts can appear near the player without being actually visible for several seconds because they possess a unique ability, the ability to pass through walls. While many games must pay careful attention to avoid bugs that cause the spawning of enemies inside walls or in otherwise inaccessible locations, the Project Zero games not only resolve this issue at its root through the very characterization of the enemies, but make it a strength. The ghosts of Project Zero can perform a series of actions that violate the normal conventions of enemy design. For example, they can vanish and reappear at will in another part of the room. In other games, enemies can reposition using certain devices, taking flight, submerging underwater, or burrowing underground. But the player can generally still follow their movements visually, or at least observe traces left on the surface they are passing through. In our case, however, the ghosts simply disappear and reappear with no prior warning. Furthermore, as already noted, they entirely disregard the presence of walls, creating a range of situations in which the player finds themselves at a severe disadvantage. For example, in a corridor with many bends, the player takes far longer to move from one end to the other compared to a ghost that cuts through corners by passing through walls. Even if the player manages to escape from the room where the ghost attacked them and closes the door behind them, the ghost can pass through it or, worse, reappear in front of the player in the very room they have just entered. Sometimes changing rooms is enough to end the encounter and the enemy disappears for good. Sometimes it continues to pursue the player. The logic governing its behavior is, once again, deliberately shrouded in mystery to keep the player on edge. Encounters are won not so much through the damage inflicted by the camera obscura via upgrades, special lenses, and film types, but rather through correct positioning relative to enemies. Since they can attack from any point in the room, including through a wall, it is essential to always seek a position with a 360-degree field of view. Yet, even when the player achieves this advantage, some ghosts can emerge from the floor or the ceiling, particularly in rooms with staircases. Furthermore, the player is able to perform a fatal frame, a shot taken at a specific moment during an enemy's attack that deals significant damage, pushes the enemy back several steps, and allows a fatal frame combo to begin. However, it sometimes happens that by chaining fatal frames one after another, the ghost is pushed back inside a wall or another obstacle, thereby interrupting the combo. While this may appear to be a disruption caused by overly cramped level design, it is in fact perfectly consistent with the franchise's design philosophy and with the nature of the enemies. The solution typically involves studying the ghost's moveset and, as it begins to approach the player to attack, stepping back to leave more space between it and the wall so as to chain more fatal frames. To make all the design ideas behind these encounters even clearer, let us take as an example a combat encounter that occurs in the latter part of Phase 6 in Project 04 against a particularly challenging ghost. The setting is a narrow, descending corridor with a single right-hand bend, after which the corridor ends at a large wooden door. As the player approaches the door, a spectral voice foreshadows the enemy's appearance by a few seconds. The ghost's moveset is not particularly varied, but one specific attack is extremely lethal. The ghost approaches the player by continuously appearing and disappearing, shifting to one side with each apparition, first to the right, then to the left, and so on, until it is flanking the player to attack them. Tracking its movements during this attack is extremely difficult, and the window for photographing it, if the player attempts a fatal frame, is minuscule. The situation is not helped by the fact that the damage dealt by its attack is truly considerable, and, in this author's view, distinctly unbalanced. The unpredictability of this attack becomes even more apparent when one considers that the player finds themselves inside a narrow and very cramped corridor, and the ghost can pass through walls, easily cutting the only corner in the environment. The game has, up to this point, pushed the player to find a particularly advantageous spot on the map to face the enemy at hand, but in a corridor of this type, no such spot exists. Normally in Project 04, when a hostile ghost appears, the doors become covered in a strange spectral energy and become locked, unlike in the earlier entries where they were always openable, thus limiting the player's combat arena to the room they find themselves in. The more attentive player during the encounter in question will realize that the game has deliberately broken the rules established so far. The door from which the ghost emerged is locked, but the one providing entry to the corridor is open, signaling to the player to move to the previous, larger room for a better chance at defeating this particularly challenging enemy. The plan works. The room in question is square and considerably more spacious, allowing better spatial awareness and reducing the risk of being surprised by the ghost emerging through a wall, while also allowing fatal frame combos to be chained without pushing the ghost into a wall. Yet, the designer still chooses to add one more layer of difficulty after rewarding the player who has moved in this location. At the center of the room, there is a trap door. This means the player can position themselves near the center, certainly the most advantageous spot, but never perfectly at it, and must continue to move around it. It is clear how the combat system of Project Zero, despite resting on very few relatively simple rules, manages to find a rare balance between positioning-based tactics and enemy unpredictability. In essence, encounters are not about the damage dealt, but about the player's attempt to regain as much control as possible over a situation that the designer has taken away from them. And precisely when they manage to achieve it, they sometimes lose it again through their own actions, thanks to the pushback caused by a fatal frame. Basing the fear factor on unpredictability is not the only path a designer can take. There exists another design philosophy that stands at the opposite end of the spectrum from that employed by Project Zero, and which works just as effectively. Programming the enemy's AI according to a precise logic that the player can learn to understand, but making it so complex that the player must continuously adapt their strategy to face it. The most striking example of this type of approach is the AI of the alien in Alien Isolation. In that specific case, the key word is adaptability. The alien appears to adapt to the behaviors the player employs to evade it, and devises new strategies to flush them out. This continuous adaptation is, of course, the product of an extraordinarily detailed behavior tree, but the player gets the impression of being up against a genuinely thinking creature whose behavior it is impossible to fully decipher during a standard gameplay session. without examining how the alien's AI was programmed through various debug tools and data mining. This represents a design philosophy that is the opposite of Project Zero's. In Alien Isolation, the designer employs meticulous control over the enemy in order to combat the player's control, while in Project Zero, they strip control from the player through unpredictability. Both alternatives are valid, not least because they are each justified by the nature of the enemies in their respective games. On one side, the perfect predator, cold and calculating. On the other, an evanescent ghost belonging to a world that operates according to logics diametrically opposed to those governing the world of the living. There is much that could be said about the level design of the Fatal Frame games, but what is most relevant to our analysis is identifying how the designer establishes safe zones in which the player learns to feel safe, only to deliberately violate them. In particular, Project 03, and to a degree the fifth entry as well, builds its entire narrative progression on this idea. But first, it is also worth discussing how the level design and the placement of objects reinforce the characterization of the environments, the player's familiarity with them, and at the same time consistently hold surprises in reserve to prevent them from ever taking anything for granted. In all the Project Zero games, backtracking is a fundamental component of gameplay progression. The reasons behind this choice are multiple and interconnected. First, it is worth remembering that in almost all great horror works, the two most carefully crafted elements are the main antagonist and the setting. The latter is not simply the context in which the story unfolds, but often ends up being a fully fledged character within the work itself. As a result, exploring the same location repeatedly allows the player to become better acquainted with this character of the setting. Backtracking is not, however, solely a player's choice. The game itself demands it. As already mentioned, some doors can only be unlocked after exorcising a ghost that is keeping them sealed through a curse whose origin is often located far from the door in question. To find out where this ghost is, the player must photograph the door, after which an image appears on screen showing the location where the spirit can be found. If the player has explored the environment and learned it well by observing it carefully, they will immediately recognize the location shown in the photograph. Moreover, the evident graphical advances from the fourth entry onwards allow environments to be characterized by numerous decorative elements, making it easier for those who have explored carefully to recognize the area shown in the photograph. Whereas in the earlier entries, the rooms were fairly sparse. Finally, it is worth noting that the player is generally free to roam the available map back and forth at will, with the exception of certain doors locked for narrative reasons. Thus, on the journey towards the location shown in the current photograph, the player can freely explore the rooms adjacent to the path they are taking, often finding new objects in areas they had already thoroughly searched. Some of these objects are simple consumables, while others are books and texts that add important details to the game's story. Or, in some cases, even objects needed to complete side quests or unlock alternative endings. In some instances, it is not objects that are to be found, but ghosts to defeat, which, once vanquished, activate triggers or leave collectible items on the ground. In conclusion, backtracking is, above all, a means of characterizing the environment and narrating the story. On one hand, it is required by the game and rewards the most attentive players, instilling in them a sense of security and control over the situation. But at the same time, the mysterious appearance of objects and ghosts in already explored locations keeps the player on edge, stripping them of control. In Project Zero, there are no true safe zones. For example, the player can save the game in specific areas of the map by interacting with lanterns, which, however, are deactivated whenever a ghost is present in the room. Enemies can enter the rooms housing these lanterns without any restriction whatsoever. Once the ghost has been dealt with, the player can interact with the lantern again to save the game. This is a fairly classical approach. The original Resident Evil adopted a far more radical one, where saving required the use of ink ribbons for a typewriter, a limited consumable item, meaning the player never knew how many copies of this item they would find over the course of the adventure. At the same time, these typewriters were located inside specific rooms that were genuine safe zones where enemies could not enter. In Resident Evil, the safe zone is always respected. In the Project Zero games, they simply do not exist in principle. How then is the philosophy of establishing rules only to break them expressed when there is no safe zone to violate? The concept of the safe zone in Project Zero is not applied to individual rooms, but instead manifests in a subtler and more pervasive way through two-level design elements we have already discussed: doors and walls. As noted, some ghosts stop pursuing the player when they pass from one room to another through a door, but this is not guaranteed. The players never know whether this escape tactic has actually worked until they try it. And the cruel beauty of it is that they are never told why it works in some cases and not in others. Regarding walls, since the earliest video games ever made, walls have always been a level design element that carried a logical rule. If there is a wall between the player and the enemy must go around it or destroy it to reach the player. Ghosts violate this rule entirely, and the same applies to every physical obstacle in the room where a fight is taking place. It is also worth mentioning a particular moment in the second entry that once again employs the concept of the safe zone, albeit in an original way, to deceive the player. During the famous sequence in which the player first encounters Sei/Kusabi, the image is distorted by the monochromatic filter that signals an extreme danger the player has not yet learned to recognize. Even if they had intuited it, their instinct in that moment would naturally be to flee. But the level design of the room where this sequence takes place is rectangular and fairly symmetrical. Through cultural conditioning, the player recognizes this as an arena, and consequently infers that the game is suggesting the possibility of a boss fight. A corridor, for example, would have suggested the need to flee, exactly as happens during the first appearance of the Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. It is precisely for this reason that the designer deliberately deceives the player who, convinced they can defend themselves against Kusabi, discovers that the camera obscura cannot harm her in the slightest. The player thus finds themselves forced to flee from what appeared to be an arena where a fierce combat should have taken place. The scene just described was a single isolated moment, but the concept of the expectation of being in a safe spot and its violation becomes a structural foundation for the entire third entry of the series. The story of Project 03 follows Rei Kurosawa, who, after losing her boyfriend in a tragic car accident, begins to dream of following him into what the game calls the Manor of Sleep. The game structure is therefore divided into chapters, each in turn divided into two sections. The first takes place inside Rei's house and is split into two moments, day and night. The second section unfolds in the Manor of Sleep during Rei's dreams, after she has fallen asleep, while the latter section consists of the classic gameplay of exploration and combat against ghosts that the other games in the franchise have accustomed us to. The real-world section is a novelty for the series. In this section, Rei can investigate what occurs in her dreams by interacting with notes, books, and other objects around her home, or by asking her housemate Miku, the protagonist of the first entry, to research what she has discovered during her dreams. Up until roughly the first third of the game, the house functions as a genuine safe zone where no paranormal events occur, at most a few unsettling occurrences. The television switching on by itself, eerie voices on the telephone, objects falling mysteriously. As the story progresses, increasingly frightening events begin to occur inside the house, culminating in actual apparitions of ghosts, particularly at night. This represents, first and foremost, a perfect metaphor for the game's central theme, the danger of unresolved guilt. Rei, who holds herself responsible for her boyfriend's death, buries these feelings in her subconscious, which then erupts violently during her dreams. Because it is impossible to ignore and suppress such profound pain, confining it to the unconscious is futile. It will always find a way to seep into everyday life with increasing force until it threatens to consume it entirely. An idea represented by the invasion of Rei's home by ghosts. Indeed, all the people who dream of the manner of sleep share guilt over a loved one who is no longer with them. Following that person inside the manor means yielding ever more to these feelings, and if one penetrates its deepest reaches, one is lost entirely in them and vanishes from the real world. Nothing remains of those who are lost in the manor but a dark stain in the last place where they fell asleep. In essence, the manor's curse is a metaphor for suicide driven by unresolved guilt. Beyond the narrative dimension, what concerns us most is highlighting how the overlap between what happens in the dream and what happens in the real world is the perfect illustration of the designer's violation of the safe zone. There exists another horror game that had carried out a similar operation, Silent Hill 4. In that title, the safe zone is the protagonist's apartment, a true hub with various functions, from which the player departs to explore other worlds or dimensions tied to the apartment's history. As the game progresses, monsters begin to invade the apartment, and the structure of the space itself is altered and corrupted by malevolent entities. There are two particularly important differences in how the concept of the safe zone is handled in Silent Hill versus Project Zero 3. First, in the former, it is always possible to confront the paranormal events with the help of a specific item, even when they are inside the apartment. In Project Zero 3, Rei does not have access to the camera obscura at home, so the player knows that if one of the ghosts were not merely to make a fleeting appearance but to attack them, the only option would be to flee and hide. Furthermore, there is another apparently subtle element that allows Project Zero to perhaps instill more terror than the other title. Although it is true that in Silent Hill, the player can remove the apartment's paranormal hauntings, these disturbing manifestations alter the environment itself for as long as they remain. The setting consists of an apartment that the game never presents as a genuinely warm or welcoming home. As a result, although it is a familiar environment for the player, its appearance is shabby, uninviting, and hostile. Also, a hole in the wall that leads to other dimension doesn't help in that regard. The paranormal events merely reinforce a sense of alienation that has been present since the very beginning of the game. By contrast, Rei's house in Project Zero 3 is presented as a relatively welcoming environment, where the only noticeably dissonant element is the predominance of bluish tones, which evoke themes of mourning and sadness. It's like Rei's house was once a happy place, which is now permeated by grief, while the apartment in Silent Hill 4 seems to be rotten to the core since its foundation. Consequently, supernatural events are, paradoxically, more readily accepted within such an environment, whereas in Project Zero 3, they are perceived by the player as a genuine invasion of their personal space, a subtle but important distinction, which triggers in the player's mind an overlap and a parallel between Rei's home and their own living space, enormously increasing immersion in the game world. Unconsciously, the player begins to project Ray's experiences onto their own reality. The violation of the safe zone thus occurs at a gameplay level, but also at a meta gameplay level, a process discussed earlier. The Manor of Sleep also holds many surprises in this regard. In certain game chapters, Ray finds herself in the body of Miku or of Kei, a close friend of Yu, the protagonist's deceased boyfriend. Each of these two characters is in the Manor of Sleep, for reasons that need not be explored in detail here. But it is essential to know that while Miku is the protagonist of the first Project Zero, Kei is connected to the second entry, since the manor shifts based on whoever is dreaming within it. Some doors that are locked in the area normally explored by Ray can in fact be unlocked by Miku, leading to areas drawn from the first Project Zero. The same naturally applies to Kei, who can access rooms drawn from the second entry. After the initial surprise, once these areas are unlocked, each of the three protagonists can explore them freely. So the player either becomes familiar with them if they have not played the earlier entries, or already knows what to expect if they have. Longtime players are thus rewarded for their prior knowledge of the franchise, and this might appear to be a form of fan service that is not only self-indulgent, but actively harmful to the sense of uncertainty on which these games rely, since those familiar with the older titles can navigate the areas perfectly from the very first exploration. In reality, however, this is yet another trap laid by the designer. Not only are these sections extremely well justified and integrated into the game's narrative, but precisely when the player thinks they already know what to expect in the next room, they find themselves in an area that, in the original game it belonged to, was located somewhere entirely different. While these transplanted sections initially follow their original layout, that scheme is soon completely overturned, plunging even the most seasoned player into uncertainty. Moreover, some of the enemies in these rooms return, but with new attack patterns. For example, when Kei encounters the Kasabi from Project Zero 2, the player initially assumes that simply leaving the room will prevent the ghost, who is invincible, to follow them. Exactly how it happened in the original encounter. However, they soon discover, to their dismay, that the room's doors are locked, forcing them to wait for a scripted in-game event before they can actually leave. Similarly, certain areas that in the earlier games were haunted by specific enemies are instead invaded by the ghosts introduced in the third entry, catching the experienced player off guard as they were likely already mentally rehearsing the movesets of the other spirits. The violation of the safe zone occurs in this case too, at a meta gameplay level. But the technique employed by the designer this time involves not the player's own world, but their prior knowledge of the franchise, confusing their memories. It is also worth briefly discussing the structure of Project Zero 5, which is partially inspired by that of Project Zero 3. Here too, the game alternates between exploratory sections in haunted locations and more investigative sections set in the house where the protagonists reside and which, in theory, should be shielded from spirits. In this case, a surveillance camera system is also added, allowing players to observe the paranormal phenomena that increasingly occur in the house as the story progresses. And they can also fight the ghosts with the camera obscura. This too involves establishing a safe zone, only to violate it, but there is a key difference from the third entry. In Project Zero 5, the haunted locations exist within the same plane of reality as the house, and the protagonists can reach them physically, making it far more foreseeable that spirits might follow them home and invade their personal space. In Project Zero 3, by contrast, the Manor of Sleep resides in an entirely different reality, that of the dream, and so the presence of ghosts in the house strikes the player on a far deeper level. Project Zero 5 features a marked increase in gameplay pace compared to the other entries in the franchise. This stems from numerous factors. The controls are more responsive, the addition of 60 frames per second support contributes to this, animations are faster, and visual and audio feedback during gameplay actions are plentiful. Combat also becomes more action-oriented. Not only do ghosts have weak points that can only be targeted by correctly angling the camera obscura, something that in the Wii U version is achieved by using the gamepad itself as a camera, but taking standard photographs without waiting for the fatal frame moment also triggers new weak points to photograph. The flow of play certainly benefits from this, but some of the nuances on which the mood of the earlier entries was founded are lost in the process. The general slowness of those games was coherent with the concept of the enemies, eternally trapped in a limbo between past and present, and with the context in which they moved, namely locations steeped in Japanese folklore that embodied stillness and rigor. In essence, there was a harmony between all the components of those titles that has been sacrificed in favor of improved playability. Something also made evident in the remastered versions of the second and fourth entries, which find themselves caught, sometimes without finding a clear direction, between the need to modernize outdated titles and that of preserving their tone and atmosphere. This is an extremely difficult balance to achieve, and in a market as saturated with remakes and remasters as the current one, there's no shortage of examples to examine. In our case, it is particularly illuminating to consider how different the approaches of the Silent Hill 2 remake and the latest entry in the franchise, Silent Hill F, are from one another, even though they were released barely a year apart, keeping in mind that they're developed by different studios. Silent Hill 2, first of all, recreates the original game's visual style from scratch while striving to remain as faithful as possible to the original vision, which is by no means a given. The Demon's Souls remake, for example, drastically changed the character models of certain NPCs for no apparent reason. And in a game of that type, the visual design of NPCs is carefully crafted to provide the player with story elements and clues about the game world. Examining the control feedback and animations, Silent Hill 2 strikes a near-perfect compromise between intuitive, relatively responsive controls and realistic animations that play out at a speed appropriate to the protagonist's physicality, allowing effective defense against enemies without granting the player excessive control. The remake appears, in essence, to represent a version of the game faithful to what the original team's vision would probably have been had they had today's technologies at their disposal. Let us now examine the approach of Silent Hill F. In this case, we are dealing with a new entry rather than a remake, and it can therefore move in any direction without necessarily being faithful to another work in the franchise. However, in order not to completely alienate its audience, it must inevitably adhere, in some way, to the conventions the series has established, albeit with the usual variations on the theme. The combat system of Silent Hill F, however, seems to have been lifted wholesale from an action game and inserted into a horror context where the protagonist Hinako should, at least at the start of the game, be relatively vulnerable, and it clashes strongly with the other components of the game. For example, Hinako can perform a dodge that covers several meters in a fraction of a second, and a perfect dodge mechanic is also included that allows the player to recover lost stamina. There is also a focus system that highlights when an enemy is about to attack and enables a preemptive strike capable of dealing significant damage and stunning the enemy. And during the attack animation, if the enemy is struck, a brief freeze frame occurs to emphasize the moment, as if it were a God of War game. Finally, weapons degrade over time and break with a frequency not far from that of The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, forcing the player to constantly find replacements. In short, there are a series of game systems that appear entirely foreign to the rest of the work. While it is true that one of Silent Hill F's themes is the protagonist's struggle for emancipation within a patriarchal society that seeks to confine her to well-defined roles, and that a greater focus on the combat system is therefore legitimate as a way of making it a ludic metaphor for this struggle, it would perhaps have been wiser to offer increasingly effective offensive tools, both in terms of mechanics and feedback, as the story progressed rather than from the very outset. But even a progression of this kind would not resolve the fundamental problem with the feedback, namely the lack of coherence in its direction. On one hand, the high control responsiveness, the rapid dodge covering a considerable distance, and the freeze frame during attacks all seem to favor greater player control. On the other, the dodge is so fast that the camera often struggles to keep up, so the framing of the action makes it difficult to read the situation, and the character frequently gets stuck in elements of the environment, thereby reducing the player's control. If we are talking about upscaling textures, improving the lighting system, slightly increasing the polygon count, and making a few small adjustments to render game systems more comfortable for the player, particularly in the case of UI and interactions, a remaster may be sufficient. If, on the other hand, game assets and animations are recreated from scratch and slash, or mechanics are changed or improved, then we are probably talking about a remake. But what happens when attempting to reach a middle ground? The remastered version of The Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion is exactly that. Beyond minor quality of life improvements, the entire visual presentation of game was rebuilt using Unreal Engine 5, with one single exception, the animations. The effect achieved has few parallels in the current market. In the case of a standard remaster, the player perceives that they are in front of an old game adapted to modern systems through upscaling and similar techniques, and feels no particular incongruity in this. The Oblivion remaster, by contrast, looks like a contemporary game but plays like an old one, producing an unwanted feeling of alienation in the player. The primary source of this is the contrast between a visual style that is absolutely up to date and animations that come directly from 2006, a contrast that betrays the project's true nature. Looking at in-game screenshots, it appears to be a title released today, even though, admittedly, the graphical glow-up was at the expense of the art direction. The moment the game comes to life, the illusion collapses, and the player, especially one unaware that they are in front of a remastered version of an old title, is left completely disoriented. The sensation is similar to that of watching a film in which an elderly actor plays a younger version of themselves, their features de-aged through deepfake technology. In many scenes of Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, the protagonist, played by Robert De Niro, looks young, but his movements are unmistakably those of an elderly person, and this significantly diminishes the viewer's suspension of disbelief. The case of the Oblivion remaster offers us the opportunity to pose a question. Returning to the horror genre, is it possible to recreate the same identical feelings of alienation and uncertainty found in older titles when technology has advanced to the point of approaching photorealism? It is worth examining the most recent title in the Project Zero franchise, the remake of the second entry, separately, in order to understand the approach chosen by the developers in modernizing a title that is now over 20 years old, without stripping it of its identity. Starting with the visual presentation, the remake features an exceptionally refined lighting system, which, however, is never afraid to work at a very subtle level, often favoring almost total darkness over deliberate visual legibility. At the same time, it is capable of showing its full power in the more cinematic moments. In essence, the mastery of environmental lighting is nonetheless subordinated to the intent of offering the player poor visibility conditions, thereby granting them less control over the situation. The Ghost models, too, strike a good balance between graphical detail and the ineffability inherent to their nature, thanks to a careful use of particle effects and shaders which, as with the lighting system, are technologically advanced but almost never flood the screen with excessive visual feedback. The textures themselves, however, are perhaps too well defined for the task at hand, at times making the ghosts look more like zombies wrapped in a vaguely spectral aura. At the same time, the introduction of a delay into the camera obscura focusing system blurs the appearance of enemies during combat, increasing the player's sense of unease as they struggle to clearly identify what they are facing. Another subtle but telling detail, representative of the degree to which certain modern stylistic tendencies have permeated an established franchise, is a noticeably heavier use of blood. The Project Zero series has always distinguished itself through a very restrained use of blood compared to other horror titles, partly for thematic reasons. Blood connotes life force, whereas ghosts are bearers of concepts tied to death, and their attacks do not physically wound the player. Its presence is still justified in the locations where the characters who became ghosts in the game died. However, in the remake, the presence of blood, both on the ghosts themselves and throughout the environments, has been substantially increased, with the apparent intention of accentuating the title's horror elements and, in all likelihood, of exploiting the more advanced technological tools available to the developer to render it with greater realism. This abundance of gore, however, ends up stripping a bit of visual identity from the game, which, in the original, stood apart from its competitors precisely through the ineffability and evanescence of both its enemies and its environments. The excessive use of blood ultimately desensitizes the player to its presence, whereas in the earlier titles, precisely because of its sparing use, it served as a powerful danger signal. Another interesting aspect, given the mixed reactions from players, especially those new to the franchise, is an unusually intensive use of film grain in post-processing. It is ironic to note that many players complained that its use is excessive and makes the image too difficult to read, when this is precisely the designer's intention. Not to mention that the use of grain is a particularly fitting choice given the centrality of the concept behind the camera obscura. Turning to gameplay, a number of quality-of-life improvements have been introduced. A minimap in the upper right corner of the screen, status summaries for side quests, greater clarity when consulting the in-game map, and new feedback cues when key items for the main quest are found. Specifically, every time an item essential to the story's progression is discovered, the game alerts the player that the map has been updated and displays an icon indicating where the item needs to be placed. These are small touches that some purists might regard as symptomatic of an excessive desire to hold the player's hand, but it should be noted that they are entirely optional. The player who genuinely wants to feel lost in the village of Minakami and rely solely on their own memory and instincts can ignore these aids altogether. The same applies to the structure of the side quest journal, which not only displays a log of every step in a given quest, but also indicates in which chapter the next step will occur. This ensures that the player does not risk missing a crucial juncture in a quest, knowing they must progress it before the end of a particular chapter. But at the same time, it removes some of the mystery surrounding it. What is not optional, however, is the on-screen prompt that appears when the player is standing in front of interactable elements and doors. Since this only appears when the player is practically right next to them, a careful observation of the environment is still required, and it does not excessively undermine the exploration experience. The question of the camera obscura's new functions is more nuanced. It is now equipped with 4 lenses possessing special powers, each applying a color filter to the image that makes the image more readable. One of these lenses allows the player to see ghosts through walls, enabling them to anticipate enemy movements and exercise greater control over the flow of encounters. Again, using this lens is entirely optional, but its introduction appears to be the product of a compromise between the designer and a player base accustomed to more contemporary game conventions. It is as though the designer anticipated a possible sense of bewilderment in the player when confronted with a ghost that passes through an obstacle, rather than owning this feature as a distinctive element of the enemy's moveset. It is not difficult to imagine the complaints from many players, perhaps unfamiliar with the franchise, or simply more casual, who see their fatal frame combo broken by a ghost disappearing into a wall, rather than appreciating the mechanic as something coherent with the enemy's nature and the game's identity. It is, in short, a reasonable compromise for a general audience, but one that perhaps betrays a slight lack of confidence on the part of the designer. On the front of controls and responsiveness, the game strongly recalls the approach taken in the Silent Hill 2 remake. The protagonist, Mio, responds to inputs with a delay that is near perfect relative to the rhythm of the gameplay the designer is aiming for and to the physicality of the character, and her animations are deliberately stiff, but never to the point of pulling the player out of immersion. Particularly impressive is the work done on door opening, which manages to pay homage to the suspense generated in the older entries of the franchise thanks to the slowness of the animation, while simultaneously introducing a mini-game within it. Every time Mio opens a door, the gesture is extremely slow and deliberate, and this time, there is no room for doubt as to whether it is the designer's intent or a technological loading limitation between areas. During this gesture, the in-game camera zooms in tightly on the door itself. Each time a door is opened, there is a chance that a ghost will spawn on the other side, leading to a full encounter. The probability is low but concrete enough to keep the player constantly on edge. And when it does happen, the camera has drawn so close to the door that the ghost's terrifying face fills the entire screen, accompanied, naturally, by an unsettling shriek. And the player must press the dodge button in time or risk having their stamina bar completely depleted. It is fair to say that, aside from a few perhaps slightly too accommodating choices, the remake does a generally commendable job of striking a balance between the need for modernization and the desire to preserve the spirit of the franchise, and gives good reason to be optimistic about its future. If a designer faces the arduous task of creating a title that pays homage to certain works of the past using modern technology, they risk producing a result without any clear direction. And this applies, as we have seen with the Oblivion remaster, even to re-editions of older titles. This is due to a contrast between the stiffness of controls, animations, and feedback on one hand, and a contemporary visual style on the other. A contrast that the player perceives, for purely logical or culturally conditioned reasons, as unintentional. It is as if graphical fidelity automatically precluded the use of feedback that the designer deliberately renders cumbersome. If, on the other hand, that type of feedback is embedded within a game with a deliberately retro aesthetic, the player accepts it without perceiving any artifice whatsoever. It appears that certain types of animation and control are inextricably linked to visual presentation, and that the player can only truly accept them as intentional design choices when they appear within a visual context that is either unrealistic or inclined towards realism but executed with outdated technology, This process is similar to that which occurs when attempting to produce a live-action film based on an animated work, striving to remain as faithful as possible to the source material. The live-action remakes of Disney classics highlight how certain gestures, expressions, situations, forms of comedy or drama simply only work through the filter of animation, and when translated into a story without any form of adaptation, break the viewer's suspension of disbelief. Thinking of similar operations in the video game domain, one might cite The Medium, a homage to fixed camera classic horror games, but with a visually realistic aesthetic. Reviews criticized the protagonist's stiff animations, which were in fact deliberately modeled on those of the games it sought to pay homage to. Games in which, at the time, they were not criticized but considered an integral part of the title and of the pact between designer and player. In essence, the older titles produced through all the techniques and deliberate constraints employed by the designer, a sense of the uncanny that the player perceived as intentional. Today, this sensation, examined at a superficial level, should theoretically yield even greater results by blending modern elements with more nostalgic ones, precisely because it is grounded in a subtle contrast between elements that are similar but different enough to produce the uncanny. However, the key word is subtle. Working on a game's visual appearance is an extremely visible operation. It is, quite literally, the first element the player perceives. For this very reason, designers who wish to pay homage to certain characteristics of past video games must study carefully not only what those works offered in terms of content, mechanics, and themes, but also how the player received what the game intended to communicate to them, pad in hand. In essence, the game designer must be extremely aware that every choice they make regarding any aspect of the game, from gameplay to the visual presentation and game feel, can give the player more or less control. And the management of control is closely tied to the gameplay experience the designer wants to offer, and to the themes explored by their game. Every element must be carefully considered. Every choice, even the most subtle one, matters. We have reached the end of this long, very long journey. I definitely underestimated the workload behind this project, especially when it came to researching video materials to support the thesis and fact-checking. So please forgive me if I made any mistakes or inaccuracies, and let me know so that I can eventually correct them. This is a series and a topic that I care about deeply, so this video will probably be the last one of its kind, since it originated from a personal interest, not from the fact that I genuinely enjoy editing 2 hours of video about random topics. I tried to be as objective as possible throughout the analysis, so I will use this space for my personal thoughts regarding the Project Zero series. Here is my ranking. Last place, Project Zero 5. I only played it once and my memories of it are a bit blurry. I remember appreciating the themes, the story, and the setting, but I found the gameplay too fast-paced and arcade-like compared to the standards of the series. Regarding the visual aspect as well, I found everything too bright, and as a result, it is the game that scared me the least. However, the tall woman is incredibly unsettling. Fourth place, Project Zero 4, a beautiful and very frightening setting up until the halfway point of the game. Unfortunately, after that, it loses some of its impact due to the many repetitions and redundancies in the way the story is handled, and the enemies no longer feel threatening enough. An honorable mention goes to Kageri's room, the single most terrifying room in the entire series. Third place, Project Zero, the original. Well, it is the first game in the series, so it deserves credit for creating a formula that I clearly love, but of course the following titles further refined and improved upon it. Second place, Project Zero 3. Probably the game with the most potential in the series and one that deserves a remake. Personally, I consider it the scariest of them all, and the way the story's themes intertwine with the game's structure is simply brilliant. However, I feel that it is genuinely too long for what it offers, and the pacing starts to suffer in the final third of the game due to overly discontinuous story beats and excessive backtracking. First place, Project Zero 2. It is scary, it has excellent pacing, the setting is my favorite, and overall, it offers the most complete representation of what the series stands for. I can only put it in first place. And yes, it is obvious by this point that I think the remake is a great game. Well, that's everything. I think it's time for me to finally get some well-deserved rest.